any kind of creating is cool. And so I get up every morning excited to write. And honestly, like when I go to bed at night, I set up the coffee and I get kind of excited and I can't sleep at first because I'm pretty excited to make art in the morning. So I think that's just like straight through from my mom into my personality.
Hey, it's CNF, the greatest podcast in the world, the creative nonfiction podcast, where I speak to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories, how they became who they are, and what they're thinking about and working on. I'm your host, Brendan O'Mara. Hey. Peter Brown Hoffmeister makes his return to the show. You can check him out on episode 68, long time ago, but he's back for number 204. Great talk. Can't wait for you to hear it. Hey, make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you get your podcast, and to keep the conversation going on the social networks, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, at CNFPod. Also, head over to BrendanO'Mara.com, for show notes, and to sign up for the monthly newsletter where I give out reading recommendations and what you might have missed from the world of the podcast. That's fun. Hey, you've heard me say it before, but don't we all need editors? I know I sure as hell do. If you want to get in better shape, you hire a personal trainer. Likewise, if you need your book or essay whipped into shape, or you need an accountability coach, reach out to yours truly, Brendan at BrendanO'Mara.com. And we'll start a dialogue. Why not, right? I'd be honored to serve you in your work. I'm not sure how many of you noticed, but for shits and giggles, I started up the Casualty of Words podcast again as a, quote, podcast diary of a book project, end quote. As I rewrite and retype the baseball memoir turned novel turned memoirval, whatever the hell it is, certain things crop up and I riff on them for Casualty of Words. Riff. It's a micro podcast, and most of the episodes are less than 2 minutes long. So check it out. Why not? What do you have to lose? Just, you'll get more of this. Is this what you want? Are you not entertained? Want to read a new review I got over on Apple Podcasts. We're at 88. Let's get to 100. Come on. Let's do it. If you had a podcast, I'd review it. If you leave a review, I might just read it on the air as a way of saying thanks. So this one from Big Two Hearted is titled Breakthrough. I listen every week and return to some of my favorites every now and then. Writing is a solitary act, and this podcast makes it less so. We get inside the brain of some great writers and hear their frustrations, struggles, strategies, and successes in their process. Lets me know I'm not alone when I'm struggling. Brenda does a great job of getting them to talk about their process. I love hearing about different topics and subjects about which writers are writing. Stimulates my brain. One thing I really appreciate about Brendan's approach is that he has a handful of questions that he poses to writers. Over time, then we get to hear a myriad of experiences regarding process, about getting over and around tough times and hurdles in the process, about inspirations, about who and what do you read, and other unique responses to common themes around the craft of writing. Sometimes Brendan gets a bit long in posing questions or in commenting after the interviewee answers, but that also makes the show more conversational in nature. This podcast is just part of my weekly routine. Well, thank you for that wonderful review and for the criticism. That said, all right, this podcast, speaking of me being long-winded, this podcast with Pete is more conversational than most, mainly because we had a few things we felt like we wanted to talk about. So you hear a little more of me than you're accustomed to, and than maybe you'd like. For that, sorry, not sorry. Because he's not promoting a book or anything. It was just like, kind of felt like talking about some things. So we're like, let's fire up the mics. So Pete is the author of the memoir, The End of Boys, and the novels, Too Shattered for Mending, and This is the Part Where You Laugh, among a couple other books. his new podcast is called Boring is a Swear Word, and it's brilliant. You should totally listen to it. It's got little riffs and poems and essays from Pete's life. One voice, great stuff. He's the kind of guy who just makes you want to get out there and do stuff. So what do you say? Why don't we just get after it, CNFers? You ready to throw it down? You ready to spend a fun hour with one of the best writers' minds out there? He's a fellow Eugenian, someone who I consider a friend, though we've never met. This podcast made me want to get out and be better, made me want to be a better worker, made me want to work hard, and I hope you will too. Ooh, yeah. It's so like cool and quirky and just uniquely you, and it's so voice driven, and it's as the podcast sphere keeps kind of expanding and stuff, it's these things that are on the edges and on the margins that are going to be the ones that gain the most traction, I think. And yours is it's solely focused. It's a one voice podcast, and it's all these stories and little slideshows, if you will, from your life. And I just find it so engaging and really love listening to it.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's been fun to do. I got approached by a few people about doing it, and then finally, someone I really respect was like, "Hey, you got to make a podcast." It's actually my brother-in-law Caleb, who he runs Film Pack, film company, and he does all the book trailers for my books, and
cool.
he actually does book trailers for everyone. I mean, he's done it for like John Grisham and Tom Hanks and Joe Nesbo, and I mean, really, really big people. He's really good at what he does. And he was like, "I think this is like the perfect medium for you." And I was like, I don't know anything about that, but I started talking to people, and it's actually pretty fun. Right, it's hard. I mean, because you want to bring joy and you want to entertain, so that you're actually giving something. So
Exactly.
It's not just like, oh, I'm a narcissist, I'm going to throw material out there because I'm important or I have an important voice or something. Like I hope that I'm entertaining people. That's kind of the thing that you're hoping you're doing.
Yeah, of course. And that having a sort of empathic mindset is like it's always trying to be in service of a reader, and in this case, the listener. It's like, all right, so if people are going to be a fly on the wall to this conversation, it's like, well, what can we bring? And I think we're already hitting on some themes that might make an audience member think about, okay, like maybe, I don't have to, there are different levels to contextualize competition, or there are different ways to just eschew that altogether, or just, do something that is truly in service of an audience. And if you can connect with one person, like that's a start. And then you just kind of keep going from there and keep showing up. And as long as you're in the game, you're in the game. So you just keep finding ways to keep playing the game.
Exactly. And kind of what you said, just like, don't make it a competition, because if you make everything a competition, you're going to spend your life losing a lot. It's not going to help you, but then you're not really going to be able to help other people too. And I think
Right.
helping other people is important.
I was listening back to our first conversation, which is it's bananas. It was episode 68, and so it was almost like it was probably a good solid year and a half ago was when that happened. And early on in that episode, I think we were talking about the hunger and how you stay hungry. And given that we're a couple years away from that, I think you just put out your Strength and What not Strength, that's a Tracy Kidder book, Too Shattered for Mending. It had just come out, and you were working on something else. And so where's the hunger, where's the drive, what is driving you to this day, a year and a half after we first spoke on the show?
Well, I mean, sometimes I think about like what's my internal drive like, and I'd get to that in a minute, but I think you have to have role models in art, like in making art. And for me, growing up and seeing my mom make art all the time, and different art, like she was sculpting, or she was painting with acrylics, or she was painting with oils, or she was drawing with charcoal, or she was drawing with a pencil. I mean, my mom was just making art and making art and making art and making art when I was growing up. And so that taught me, I mean, from the moment I was born, I wrote on her back to her BFA classes. And so I don't remember a time when she wasn't making art, and I think that taught me that like making art is really, really important. It's valuable, and now, I mean, I still believe that every single day that making art is really important. So that lesson that my mom taught me from the moment I was born on her back in her art classes, that kind of pushed me forward. And and then also, the second part is like internal drive. I find joy in creating, whether it's telling stories on my podcast or writing poems. I've been writing a lot of poems, or like working on fiction, working on a novel. Right now, I'm writing a screenplay with another writer. I mean, just like any kind of creating is cool. And so I get up every morning excited to write. And honestly, like when I go to bed at night, I set up the coffee and I get kind of excited and I can't sleep at first because I'm pretty excited to make art in the morning. So I think that's just like straight through from my mom into my personality.
I love that this idea of it's something I've called in the past, like setting up the bowling pins, the night
Hmm.
before, because that
Hmm.
way you set them up that night before, and that way you're creating you're a little bit of anticipation, but you're also reducing the friction
Hmm.
in the morning, because when you're a little groggy and you're like, I'd rather sleep in, it's cold out. But
Yeah.
if you put your running shoes out right next to your bed, you just slip them on and go out, and it's very similar. It's like, what can you do to grease the gears? So all you have to do is sort of roll over to your workstation and get some work done. Just get something down, get something shitty down, and make it good later.
Right. And like I was lucky because I took an advanced poetry workshop with Dorianne Locks in college. And I didn't even know how lucky I was at the time because I didn't know what an incredible poet Dorianne Locks was.
Mhm.
And, later read all of her books. But she told me to just like on any scrap of paper at all times write down ideas. And so I'm constantly writing on like junk mail and little scraps of paper and receipts and everything and throwing them on my writing desk. So it's like I have so many notes on things to do. Like I could never finish all my projects that I aim to finish. And sometimes 3 years later I'll find a file and be like, oh, I wrote half a book on that topic. Man, I should finish that. But I just get so caught up. Like, I'm going to finish this collection of poetry. I'm going to finish these podcast episodes. I'm going to finish this novel. And then there's just a million things out there and so many things I want to do. But, eventually we'll die.
That is, you strike a good point too. There's this great, it's awesome that you're curating this reservoir of which you can draw inspiration from. But in that too is a lot of semi works and semi levels of production uh, can also kind of siphon the energy away from finishing maybe one good thing. And
True.
sometimes as you're working halfway through this one thing, you're like, oh, look at this shiny idea. I'd love to just be more in the honeymoon period of this than actually finish this. So how do you navigate that and stay the course on, say, I don't know, project A, and then, of course, you've got some other things stewing, but, of course, you've got to somehow lean into the one thing and finish.
Ooh, that's a really good question. Um, well, with the shiny objects on the sideline, I use a program called Self Control that just shuts down the internet basically. And
Mm.
it's free. You can download it. And that really helps me then I can just work on a Microsoft Word document on my newest novel or on a collection of poetry or nonfiction essays or whatever I'm doing. Um, so using that program helps. And then I write, I know it's kind of cheesy, but I write New Year's resolutions where I list certain numbers of things I want to do, like, writing 25 new chapters of my book this year, or if it's possible, finishing a revised draft of my newest book or something like that. Like, and I just keep looking at that. It's in my kitchen and I keep looking at it every single day for the entire year. So it's like, come back to this project, come back to this project, come back to this project. And then I try to prioritize things not for like a day or two at a time, but think like I'm going to focus on this one thing for 6 months straight until it's a lot. It's difficult. I think, there's so many things to distract us. And I think that we're like in the distractibility age. And I'm kind of astounded by all the things that distract me. I feel like It's a wild time to try to create anything that takes 2 years of focus, like a book, or 3 years.
Yeah, that it's such yeah, you make a great point about the distractibility. We're in a distractibility culture, and probably every generation would argue that too. Probably when radio came along, people were like, "Whoa, boy, back it
True,
up a
true.
second. What's with radio? This is this is going to screw everything up." Uh, but in this day and age, of course, it just the ratchet just keeps getting cranked. So it's always about removing things. Like, what can you sort of? I'm always aiming for that. Like, what can I do to just strip it down, strip it down, strip it down, and that way, because I'm distractible myself, so it's just like, what can I remove from the table and kind of Marie Kondo my mind in a way to declutter. Declutter just seems to bring me clarity.
Right. And I think people with artistic mindsets are naturally curious people. And to be an artist, you have to be curious. And the problem is there's so many paths you can chase with your curiosity now. Like I'll go down, a 20-click rabbit hole where I'm suddenly reading about something that I've never even considered in my entire life. And that's cool because that might go into a story somewhere, might go into a poem, might go into a podcast episode, might go into a fiction chapter. But if that's all I do with my time, I don't create, I don't produce. So I kind of have to balance that like curiosity time with productive time, with rest time, with outdoor time. It's tough.
And is there a way that you say you've kind of almost storyboard out a year in a sense? Is there a way you kind of storyboard your day so that you can feed the creativity, but also be doing consistent work on the big thing? So you're writing that maybe a chapter a week or whatever that is. However that manifests itself.
Yes, yes, definitely. Storyboarding the day is a good idea. Like for example, I get up earlier than everybody in my house, so I have 2 or 3 or 4 hours of quiet every morning, and that's also when my brain's freshest. So I try to prioritize my most important creative project first thing in the morning. So I'll get up, start the coffee, drink a little coffee, and stare out the window for a minute, or go outside and watch the sunrise for a few minutes, something like that, just to like wake up my brain, and then I'll go straight to my writing desk where I keep everything. And then I'll work on my most important project first because if I don't do that first, then I won't put my best brain power towards that project. And maybe sometimes, like right now, I have two projects that are most important. I'm working on the screenplay with a friend, and I'm working on this book. And so those are the two most important things. And do those things first, and then start to get to the other things, the work things, the online teaching things, the answering emails, the answering messages on Twitter and Facebook, the things that don't take as much brain power. If I do those things first, I just sap my creative brain, and then by 10 or 11 in the morning, I'm not that creative. But I try to do creative things first, then work things for a few hours, then take a nap, then some more work things, maybe work around the house, hang out with people, go outside, rock climb, hike, walk. And then at night, I do my reading. So I don't need my top creative brain for reading, but I need reading so that I'm generating new ideas. So, I'm living 1,000 lives, that kind of stuff. You have to take in so much art to have depth. And that's another thing I learned from my mom. I mean, every time we traveled, it didn't matter if we were traveling in state or if we were traveling across the United States to New York or Washington, D.C., or if we were going to Mexico or Europe. We just always went to museums, and we were always looking at art. And then at home, she had art books all over, and she had great novels everywhere, and she had loved poems. She had me memorize poems. So, there was like all of this material that was going into my brain. And without that, I don't think you have depth to your art. And that's the cool thing about the internet to me, is the possibility of, going on Google Images and looking up an entire artist's like imagery of their work, just Googling their name and hitting images, and you can look through like whatever, 60 years of their paintings or something. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I love that. Doing that on Instagram. I love following illustrators
Oh,
specifically.
yes.
Yeah, they have such a, of course, a very visual sense, but so much of their like I'm thinking of like Liana Flick, who's a New Yorker cartoonist, and she's just so irreverent and raw in her drawing, and then the writing behind the drawing is so tight, efficient, and witty. Oh my God, that's just so cool. Like and then I start thinking, I'm like, all right, what are those things? How can I apply what she's doing to what I do? Even though we're working in different medium, it's like there's still something that I can sort of cherry pick from what she's doing. And I love that sort of cross pollination of artistic media to inform the thing it is that we do.
Right. And I guess like even I'm inspired by my students and the younger generation, just like visual artists. Like I have a student who named Sabine Michael Rear, and she's now writing like graphic novel text, drawings, images, and words in Portland, and making zines and little collections. And she's inspiring to me. And then, even younger, I follow Maddie Francois on Twitter because like she'll post these images and words that make me think. That's kind of cool, just to be inspired by your students. Like I was inspired by my teachers. So that's kind of a cool progression for me.
Yeah. Do you find now that you're in a position of educating young people at South Eugene and probably elsewhere too, just internet speaking, that you're kind of it's your way of being able to pay it forward in the artistic community?
I hope so. I mean, I hope to pay it forward. I think I was so fortunate to have poetry professors in college that just poured into me. Like I had a poetry professor who would take me out to play pool every Friday night. Um, and I had Joe Millar and Dorian Locks who would have me over to their house all the time. And I don't know how they gave so much time to students. And so, like, I try to think that that's maybe my responsibility, but also my possibility. I can inspire these students to write good things, to care about art, to value curiosity. And I hope I'm paying it forward with my students. I've gotten to teach lots of different places now, and at one place, South Eugene, for a long, long time, and so I've had maybe 2,000 students now. So that's kind of crazy.
Yeah, I'm thinking it's funny. The one of the worst quotes of all time, or the mantras, is like, if you can't do, teach. And and I also have like the thing where if you can't do, interview, which is how I end every single podcast, which is just my own tongue in cheek way of just like punching down on myself. But when I look out there at the so many of the writers I admire. John McPhee's my hero. He spends most of his year teaching. Nick Flynn, who was just on the show here, he teaches at University of Houston every semester. Mary Carr, George Saunders, go right down. Andre Dubus III, all these brilliant writers who are putting out. We kind of think when we think of them, we think of the work they do, and we think that that's what ultimately sustains them. But really, what they're doing, they're primarily teachers, and I think it's real important to foster that sense of community and to realize that they're able to publish these things with great publishers and go on book tours, blah blah blah. But ultimately, they're fostering community and they're nourishing themselves by nourishing the community, I think.
First of all, how cool is it that you get to interact with people like Nick Flynn? I mean, that's pretty amazing. You've built something cool. But yeah, I think interaction is so important, even if you're just reading. Like I'm reading Mary Oliver's poems and essays right now, and just going through stacks of her work, and she's brilliant. And I'm interacting with her even though she's passed on. But also what you said about building community, I think that's the most important thing educators can do. And I think the list of people that you just mentioned, those incredible writers, do build community. And that's kind of all we can hope for in creating art, is creating community, building empathy, caring about the planet, and not just humans, but everything about the planet, flora and fauna. And, if we can recognize that we're part of this big, complicated system, that's a pretty big gift just to realize it, but then maybe to hopefully be part of the positive spreading of that message.
What's your relationship to ambition these days?
Ambition. Wow. I mean, if we're talking about ambition as far as like making money and becoming famous, then I guess, one, I don't care very much about that. Otherwise, I wouldn't teach, because teaching doesn't make you famous or make a lot of money, and it takes a lot of time. Um, but as far as ambition, like creating great work, I'd say I care a lot about ambition. Like, I am ambitious. I want to produce my best work. If that's what ambition means, then I'd say I'm fairly ambitious. I don't know. I also realize that our time here is finite, and I'm not going to complete everything I hope to complete. I'm not going to be as great of an artist as I hope to be. So maybe I'm a little bit ambitious, a little bit fatalistic in recognizing my future demise. I don't know. How do you define ambition?
I guess, before, back in the cauldron of when I started, say, this show, it was a stew of resentment and bitterness and loneliness. And so I had, at first it was I had this vision of myself of being one of those, like, those, not for those like high profile freelancers and doing the feature writing that gets, heavily sort of in the machine of the big glossy magazines. And then when that just wasn't happening, and then as I kind of worked through all that shit, because as a result of this podcast, I realized that the only person if I can really boil it down, the only person I'm ambitious with or in competition with is an older version of myself. Like, am I a little bit better than I was a year or two ago? Am I asking better questions? Is there less verbal stuttering and filler? Am I, can I, is my internal shot clock when it comes to asking a question a bit better? I think, 10 to 20 seconds is what I afford myself in a pure interview. Like, today's a little different. We're having more of a conversation over coffee, which I love.
Right.
But yeah, so I think my ambition it's changed a little bit. It's a little more inward driven versus those outward metrics of trying to have, like, a titanically downloaded podcast, or, a big publisher, or, that kind of thing, which kind of really 10 years ago was important to me. And now I realize it's like, oh, just do good work in service of the people you seek to change and seek to help. And then the
That's
rest will kind of take care of itself.
right. Right. I get that completely. I understand being in competition with yourself. And I also sense a little bit of, like, I don't know if regret is the right word in what you're saying, but maybe understanding that your old worldview wasn't as clear headed as maybe your new
Yeah.
perspective. I
Yeah.
don't know. I
I think
mean,
that's true at all. That's true, because I don't think I had the idea, like, when I saw so and so published in Outside Magazine or something, and I'm like, oh man, that's the shit right there. But you don't realize that maybe that person is also doing some content marketing on the side, or doing some ghostwriting that is kind of their anchor gig, but they're only promoting this cover story or this inside feature and outside. But I didn't know that at the time. All I was seeing was like what people were tweeting out. I'm like, God damn it, I wish I was doing that. And here I am, like, alone doing these Bleacher Report slideshows of like winners and losers from, the Coca-Cola 600. That I was doing a ton of NASCAR slideshows for
right.
$50 a piece. That took me 6 hours on a Sunday, and to watch the race, do the slideshow. I get paid $50 for that after taxes as an independent contractor. It's like I'm making you know, $35 for 6 hours of work. And I was just like getting really angry that so and so is getting these various cover stories. And I'm like, wow, my other heroes, they weren't writing these damn slideshows. And but maybe they were, and they're just not outwardly promoting that. So it was like that's where my mindset was at the time. And I still get into that because I think it's part of my DNA, but I know more to fight against it and push against it now than I did 10 years ago.
Well, I will say, since you mentioned Outside Magazine, I wrote for Outside Magazine and was featured with them this summer because of my race with Hans Florine. And that didn't really change anything. I still write blog posts that have like 3 readers and no likes. So in the end, like, even if you publish in that big place, it doesn't mean you made it forever or anything like that. Or at least that's what I've proven. Um,
Well, exactly. I follow Chase Jarvis, who's like the founder of Creative Live and world class photographer and everything. And he had a book come out recently, The Creative Calling, which is brilliant. And he was on the show in September a few months ago, and he didn't say this on the show when he was on with me, but I've heard him say it over and over again, like in his photography circles. Like some people think when they like land like a campaign with Nike, they get
yeah,
their first one, they think their life is set. Like, all right, I'm set for life. It's just going to be big campaigns for the rest of my life. But the fact is, you still need to parlay that momentum in some capacity, or sometimes it just goes fallow. Like there's probably a lot of really, I know there's a lot of very talented writers, creatives that right now shit dried up because of this pandemic.
yep,
So it's like, all right, well, what are you doing to sharpen your skills? And ultimately, and this comes up time and time again, it's like that's an outward metric, looks great on paper, but ultimately it has to be about the work and just loving doing the work, because that's where the true nourishment comes from. And when the clients dry up, and hopefully you still have some form of paying your bills, but ultimately it's like if you're not in it for the work, then it's everything else is empty.
absolutely. I love that. I think this is a really good time to sharpen our skills, just like you said. I also think this is a really good time since we're so isolated, and at least for me, since I'm an extrovert, this is weird for me. It's a good time for introspection. Um, you know, the last time I came on your show, I was talking about my memoir, The End of Boys. And while there's some things that I'm proud of, mostly just structurally in that book or writing wise, imagery wise, I, you know, I realize now looking back how arrogant I was writing that book, writing basically in that book through scenes, through vignettes, evaluating my parents' parenting of teenagers before I had teenagers myself. And I had 2 daughters when I wrote that book and when I wrote draft after draft and all that, but they were young. And when that book published, neither one of my daughters were teenagers yet. And then I'm basically publicly outing the worst 3 years of my mother and my father's lives, and then, you know, evaluating it and criticizing it pretty arrogantly, if you think about it, considering I hadn't had the same experiences yet. And so now I would write a really different book. Or like, even if it's not talking about parents, like thinking about my relationship with my oldest sister, Hillary, I outed a really tough time for her, and a time when she was really trying to be her best person, but being a teenager, is difficult. And I was the bad kid, the black sheep in the family. And in a story, even though I'm not the hero of my memoir, my brother Coop is the hero of my memoir. It still vilified Hillary. And like, I've had so much time to think over the years, but also specifically like during this pandemic time period in isolation, and to think like, well, what do I owe Hillary? And when I was a little kid, Hillary was the adventurer, and I don't think I'd be the adventurer that I am nowadays without Hillary, without who she was as an adventurous, curious, wild older sister. She would get me to climb out on the roof at night and sit out on the steep upper roof with her and talk, or she'd explore the desert. She'd lead me up crazy hikes. She'd take me out and look at something that was dangerous in the desert in Tucson. I mean, she was an awesome older sister when I was young, but my memoir just shows the Hillary of our 3 year struggle with each other, which is not really fair. And now that I've had a lot of time to think, I think like, wow, that was, me being an asshole in a few ways with my family, even though Coop looked awesome because he is awesome and he was awesome. Like there were other people at different time periods that were incredible in my life and good influences in my life.
Yeah, it goes to show about the selection in memoir, and something what you leave out is every bit as telling as what you put in, right?
Oh, absolutely. Like with nonfiction, whether it's, my podcast, boring is a swear word, or if, I'm writing a memoir or I'm writing a collection of essays, like omission is huge. Like what you leave out frames the narrative. And with my memoir, I left out so many positive things about Hillary and about my dad and about my mom that could have been in there, and like I framed the narrative maybe in a way that created a powerful, short, punchy story, but wasn't the whole truth, and I realize that now. Like I definitely balance my memoir more if I was to write that today.
What was the stew that you were drawing from at that time, which informed how you crafted the book?
Right. I think just like you were talking about with, starting this podcast that you've made into something really cool, but you started it maybe from a place of opposition and a little bit of bitterness. I think that's where I started my memoir. I was still a little bit angry about how I was treated, about how I was vilified, and so I wrote that book from kind of that white heat anger place. And, it allowed me to focus my imagery and it allowed me to focus my scene choices. And I wasn't making stuff up. Like all those crazy things did happen. But I think the omission of the good, the omission of some of the balance was left out because of, like you say, that cauldron, that fire that was underneath me. And maybe what I had with me in the pot boiling around me just wasn't all the good things that I could have thought of, that I could have considered. So I basically just don't think I was very wise at that point. I wasn't wise enough to be as empathetic as I should have been when writing a memoir.
It's funny. I think in listening to our last conversation, I think the final draft you ultimately submitted was something like your 13th incarnation of the book. So it was like it had gone through a lot of changes, a lot of rewrites, and everything. And I think it's important too. Going back to the way start of our conversation about like finishing things and stuff. I think it becomes all the more important to really finish things as fast as possible, because over the arc of all those rewrites, depending on how long that takes, like you're a different writer at the start of that than sometimes you are at the end. So it's like you either need to like sprint through and finish it, so at least the voice is consistent and the tone is consistent. Otherwise, it's like if you take too long, it's like you're a different person. The perspective that you have at the end might be so much different than you were at the beginning, and then you start getting conflated messages throughout the whole throughout the whole book.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I think it took me 8 years to write and revise and write 13 drafts of that book, and that's just too long to spend on a creative project and have the kind of outcome that you're hoping for. I think, for me at least, a 2 to 3 year per book process is a lot healthier and a lot more easily focused. And my first draft of that memoir was 500 pages, and my published draft of that was about 200 pages. And there was a lot of interesting, good stuff in the first 500. I just cut so much, and I just was ruthless. And on a sentence level, that made a better book, but maybe on an arc level, an impact level, and a relationship building level, it wasn't as good a book. I don't know.
And you've talking about some of these regrets you experienced with that book. If you were rewriting it, how what would the new book look like for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the new memoir, I think the biggest things that I left out was how my parents developed and influenced my personality when I was a kid, and how my older sister Hillary influenced my personality when I was a kid. Um, Hillary being an incredibly adventurous older sister is something that I would definitely have in there because that helped turn me into the adventurer I am today. I wouldn't be in rock climbing magazines without Hillary. And Hillary's not even a rock climber, but I recognize now that like she was such a cool, wild older sister, and she taught me to be wild and curious, and that's important. That matters. And my dad, I outed him on his worst 3 years of his life, and political beliefs that he never believed before or after, and all that kind of stuff. I think I would instead now develop more like childhood vignettes that showed like what an incredibly hard worker my dad was, and going to his residency labs and learning from him and understanding him as a medical professional, and how much effort he put into his career. And I just didn't honor really the process of the parenting that my parents did because the 3 years were so bad, and they were bad. It was really ugly. Like I said, I wasn't making stuff up, but I just was omitting so many good things. So I think I would put a lot of the childhood vignettes and travel and influence and art and you know all that kind of stuff into a book now. And it wouldn't have to be 600 pages, but just layering with some more positive scenes would have made a more depthful, interesting book, I think. But I don't know. I'm not a reader. It's hard to get away from your own work.
So how have you reconciled the fallout from the memoir in the last in the 10 intervening years?
It's difficult. I mean, my dad's amazing. Like he just supports his kids no matter what they do. Like he's always behind his kids, and he has reached out, and I've reached out to him, and we just like prioritized our relationship. So while it was really difficult during the publishing process between the two of us, we just keep hanging out, keep talking, keep calling on the phone, keep finding ways um, to matter to each other. Like we decided to go to Omaha, Nebraska, to watch the College World Series because it had been 50 years since he'd played in the College World Series as a center fielder for Stanford. And so we went there the summer before last and just spent a week there watching doubleheader college baseball games. And it was like, it was awesome. So my dad has just decided that our relationship is the most important thing. So while I definitely have apologized for things that I put in the memoir to him, he basically said like, that's not as important to me as our long-term relationship. So that's kind of amazing. And then my mom and I connect on art. She paints every single day in her studio in Tucson, and she actually writes a little bit in the morning and then paints for 6 to 8 hours. So we have a lot to connect on because we both care about art so much. So as far as Fallout goes, I just tried to reach out over and over, and it's harder for my younger siblings because they weren't as involved in the memoir. They aren't really in the memoir very much, and a couple of them don't know that time period at all, and so that's maybe a little bit harder for them to understand. And so I've just had to explain to them that I'm sorry that it was so negative, and all you can do is apologize that maybe you made that focus a little too tight and, hurt their feelings. But on the other hand, they weren't alive then. So, or they weren't old enough to recognize a lot of the things that were going on. So that's maybe the more awkward family moments.
Do you think that your relationship with let's just say your parents in particular is as strong now, if not is as strong as it is now as a result of kind of purging what you were able to purge out of the memoir?
That's a good question, and that's something that I've really wondered. Um, like, what would our relationships be like if that book didn't exist? I don't know if I ever would have been able to be as honest as I was in that book, which is weird. Even as I'm saying, like I omitted so many things, I was also really, really honest. And when you're that honest with people, you open up a different kind of relationship. So in that way, memoirs are very, very cool if people can reestablish quality relationships. And in a way, like with my mom, because my mom is a career artist and she inspired me so much. She really gets that I love to write and that I love to create and that I love to tell stories on the podcast, or I love to write poems, or I love to write stories. So in that way, that first book and it being published and me starting a writing career developed a different and deeper kind of relationship between me and my mom, even as I hurt her so much. So that's just tough to know. I don't know. I think your question's just really good.
I'd like to talk about the nature of sacrifice that comes into doing any kind of creative work. And a lot of people want to do this kind of thing. They want to maybe podcast, or they want to write books like you've been able to write books and dive into all these different kind of creative things. But ultimately, to do that kind of work does require some degree of sacrifice. If you want to get in better shape, if you want to have a 405 deadlift, you gotta, eat a certain way, you gotta train a certain way, and often you gotta eschew a lot of other creature comforts that would that might poison those kind of goals. So I wonder for you, like in terms of maybe with your art, and you can even extrapolate this to climbing or whatever kind of physical pursuits you might have. But what is your relationship to the sacrifice that goes into doing the work that you want to do?
That's also a good question. My wife Jenny always says she knows exactly what I'm doing. She knows me, and part of that is that I just keep doing the same things over and over and over and over. I like to get up every single morning and write. That's what I like to do. That's what I love to do, and I climb at the same place over and over and over. You know, during this coronavirus isolation time, my daughter Rainey and I have been climbing at the columns, the same place I've been climbing now for 21 years. And I never get bored. I just want to climb the same things over and over and find little variations and perfect my craft on all the things I've climbed 1,000 times. So I don't mind that repetitiveness. And I think, that also makes me an annoying person because I'm a little bit obsessive and I tend to let other things go. Like, I really don't care about having the perfect house or the perfect yard or the perfect car or whatever. I just, for me, adventure and writing and relationships with people are more important than everything else. And that's cool if you're into relationships and climbing and writing, but if you're not, then I might not be your favorite friend. It's difficult. You have to say no to so many things to create better art. And it's just constantly saying no to things. And even as I try to open up my mind and say yes to more things, I realize over and over that I have to go back to no. And I have to go back to saying, nope, tomorrow morning I'm writing. Nope, tomorrow morning I'm writing. Nope, tomorrow morning I'm writing. And that's just a long-term commitment. And that's both good and bad.
Yeah, that is so crucial. Like I think a lot of people they don't realize how much you have to say no to if you want to pursue something, or if you have that goal, you want to write that book, that essay, start that podcast. It all seems great when you see the things that you admire published. You're like, they just seem to appear, but you don't often realize the rigor and the tenacity that goes underneath that to get it out every week, or to get that book written for you like every 2 to 3 years. They just see the thing show up, but they don't see the grind and the things you had to say no to get that thing done.
Right. And that's like that's the example of my dad. My dad became an incredible doctor, um, by just pursuing residency after residency and becoming a specialist and then a subspecialist and taking residencies in Arizona and in Switzerland and in Seattle and coming back to Eugene. I mean, he just worked so hard, and he worked so hard every single day. And I watched him do the work daily. And I think that kind of daily grind, but not even just grind, like joy in the process. Like my dad loves working hard, and my hard work is very, very different. I'm not a doctor, and my hard work in rock climbing, getting to the level I've gotten to, or my hard work in writing, getting to the level I've gotten to, which is not that great, but is some level of professionalism, that that's not possible without taking joy in that daily work and just working and working and working and working.
In the poem you sent me, there was such so many great lines in that, and I think one there's a line that you wrote, that the truth that even the new growth will not be the same as the old, that really stuck in my ear. I'm like, wow, that's gonna really apply to a lot of us. And I wonder, where did that come from? That discomfort that single line comes from. That you're that the discomfort that the old thing is not going to be there, and you're going to have to lean into the green as the other things sort of die off.
I mean, what I thought was my original inspiration for that line was my car accident and my brain injury, and understanding the new way that I think about the world. But I think also any line like that in your writing comes from all of the writers that you've read that were incredible. Like right now I'm reading so much Mary Oliver, but also those little lines that show that humans are always changing. Like Zadie Smith, she details that so well in her novels, or Jhumpa Lahiri, in her fiction. And I think fiction sometimes speaks so much to truth. And so those authors are influencing you. Those authors are in your brain. And I think anytime you come across a line like that, you're like, okay, well, that's individually true for me, but that might be universally true. And with poems, I'm always thinking like, how can I tie my individual experience with a collective, universal experience, and then maybe allude to a third thing? I try to avoid false dilemmas or even two options, but always saying like, there's so many options out there. And so that's what I'm always trying to do in poetry, but also probably in storytelling. Like there's a million options. We always have options.
Do you think I could trouble you to read that poem?
Yeah, I would love to read that poem. This poem is titled Fairy Tales for Terrified Children. The decomposing loam is a smell so strong after the rain, it's almost a taste in my mouth. Mixes with the long-eared sage and juniper, not bearing but sticky with resin, as the pine cones of the ponderosas fall through the lower trees like squirrels who've lost their branches. I've lost my branches as well, but I don't talk about it, won't say, my brain is not what it used to be, I'm not capable of what I used to do, and everything feels different. I walk out past the last volcanic boulder, where a small patch of trees were struck by lightning a few years ago, and, burned, the hollow skeletons that remain are riddled by wind-smoothed holes. Under my feet, the cryptobiotics break in pans of dirt, spaces opening between the trees, bitterbrush giving shade to the ground, where I discover a coyote kill, a mule deer pulled down, eaten, and torn apart, the deer's antlers turned into the soil as if he tried to fight the earth. I do not know how it feels to be encircled by a pack. New enemy always snapping its jaws from behind. If you bend your neck to look, another ready to advance on your blind side. I do not know how it feels to be a mule deer, but I do know what it means to step away from my life, or have my life step away from me, to see the black burned trees of my past, the truth that even the new growth will not be the same as the old. I know the difficulty of being an animal, of being a human, rain washing the bones coming up through the wildflowers, sun-bleached spine, a scapula like a wide, flat spoon, ribs that remind me of tines on pitchforks carried by villagers, humans coming through forests in search of monsters.
Oh, that's awesome, man. That's so cool and raw. What was it like? Take us into the. It's perfect. I think a perfect way to segue. Question for it. Take us into the bones of that. Where did you feel alive while writing that? Something that's outside of your comfort zone. I take it. So I don't know. Take us into the bones of this poem.
Well, for me, so much of my writing, so much of my podcasting, everything is centered around like being in the natural world. I always try to ground everything in setting, in place. And so for me, this poem came out of going on an exploring walk on BLM land near the Sisters Boulders, where I spent a lot of time camping with my daughters and my wife, my dogs. And I was walking out from the boulders and I came across this kill, and every time you find a large kill out in the wild, for me, that's a moment where I just kind of explore through the kill and look at how everything was taken apart, and I try to imagine the whole experience. I remember reading Pete Fromm's memoir, Indian Creek Chronicles, a book that I love, and he would always go through kills and kind of figure out how everything happened. There's the famous moment in his memoir where the bobcat jumps on the deer's back and then the deer runs it off a cliff. And that scene was probably in the back of my mind as I was looking at this coyote kill of this mule deer. So for me, like, grounding it in place and grounding it in a real event is important. And then I always try to think, like, what's my personal emotional experience and how can I write that well? And then how can I relate that to the universal collective experience so that the poem can build community with the reader, so they feel like, you know, they're getting to look at the poem. Obviously, they're getting to look at the kill in the poem, but they're also getting to look through my eyes and my emotional experience. And then I'm allowed to kind of expand that moment and talk about something bigger. And so by the end of the poem, with the villagers going through the forest with their pitchforks, I think in our culture we're always looking for monsters, but maybe there are more good people. Maybe there are more good moments that we need to talk about. Maybe we need to love our experience here, even if we're going to end in death.
What's the internal calculus that you were going through when you're like, I'm going to take this experience and write a poem versus a short personal essay?
That's a good question, and I like that phrasing, the internal calculus, because I feel like we're always working through such incredible equations in our lives, and we're always balancing things and always trying to figure out the math of our experiences. For me, it has a lot to do with what I'm reading and what I'm inspired by. So if I'm reading a lot of poems and really inspired by poems, I'm probably going to write some poems. And if I'm reading incredible fiction, I'm probably going to be more inspired to write fiction. Although that's not always true. I don't always know why or how I'm inspired to write in certain genres. I just love all writing. I just love everything about the writing process in any way, shape, or form, whether it's writing for the podcast or writing a poem or writing a novel or writing a memoir. I just love the process no matter what. So I just go with whatever I'm most inspired. And I guess that's advice I always give when I teach at writing workshops, like adult writing workshops, or if I teach a class at a college, or if I teach my high school students. I always tell them, don't allow for writer's block. I always have a book of poems that I'm working on, a book of nonfiction essays that I'm working on, a novel or two that I'm working on right now, a screenplay, also the podcast. So it's not whether or not I'm going to write in the morning, it's what I'm choosing to work on. So, writer's block isn't a thing. You're just choosing between options and you just write every single day, no matter what.
My goodness, that was fun. Big thanks to Pete, and to you, of course, the listener. Yeah, this is a new outro. Letting it riff. Why not? And I'm going to reward one lucky person who actually listens all the way to the end. You ready? If you ping the show on Twitter at CNFpod and just say like, hey, brother, whoa, with the secret code, I'll give you a copy of Ben Cohen's The Hot Hand. You ready? Here's the code. Master of Puppets. That's it. This show is produced, hosted, and everything's by me, Brendan O'Mara. Hey, and remember, if you can do, interview. See ya.